Hello there, seeker of silence. If these quiet stories bring you peace, feel free to subscribe, so there is always another tale waiting for you when the night grows long. Tonight, we walk the dim-lit docks of Baldur's Gate, where lanterns sway above dark water and old deals linger longer than the tide, where merchants speak in lowered voices and the weight of a coin is not always measured in gold. There was once a man who knew these docks better than most. Not by map, nor by name, but by memory. His name was Halvarin Doss, a merchant by trade, a survivor by habit. And in the quiet hours between one tide and the next, when ships rested and the city's breath slowed, he would sit beside a worn wooden crate near the edge of the harbor. And remember, it was there we find him now. The night had settled low over Baldur's Gate, casting long shadows across the planks. A faint mist hovered above the water, drifting between anchored ships whose hulls creaked with the slow rhythm of the tide. Halvarin sat with his back against a stack of crates, a small lantern at his side casting a narrow pool of amber light. His coat, once fine, had been mended too many times to hide its age. One sleeve bore a darker patch where salt water had long ago claimed its color. He held a cup in one hand. Not wine, not ale, something stronger, not for warmth, but for memory. He turned the cup slightly, watching how the liquid caught the lantern light. Then, after a moment, he spoke, not to anyone in particular, but not entirely to himself either. There was a night, he said, his voice low, steady, shaped by years of bargaining and careful speech, when the fog came in thicker than this. The harbor answered with a distant creak of rope against wood. Halvarin's gaze drifted across the docks, though his eyes no longer followed the present. They said a ship had come in early, he continued. No banners, no call, just appeared. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. No one claimed it at first. That was how these things often began, not with noise, but with absence. He set the cup down beside him and rubbed his hands together slowly, as though recalling the chill of that night. The harbor master didn't like it, Halvarin said. Said the tide hadn't turned right. Said no vessel could have come through that stretch without being seen. A faint smile touched his lips. He was right. He paused, listening, not to the harbor, but to something older. I went anyway. Of course he did. Men like Halvarin did not stay away from strange things. They followed them, because strange things had often carried value or danger, and sometimes both. He pushed himself up slowly, as though the memory required movement. His boots met the wooden planks with a soft, worn sound as he began to walk along the edge of the dock. The lantern he carried now cast longer shadows, stretching across ropes, barrels, and the occasional coil of chain left behind after the day's work. That ship, he murmured, was smaller than I expected. He stopped, turning slightly toward the water. Low in the water, too low. He could see it still. Not clearly, but enough. It had no markings, no name, no crew on deck. He exhaled slowly. That's what made it wrong. A ship without a name was one thing. A ship without sound was another. Halvarin took another step forward, his gaze following the imagined outline of that vessel as it rested against the dock. The gangplank had already been lowered, he said, just enough to touch the wood. An invitation, or a warning. He had never been certain which. I remember thinking, Halvarin continued, that whoever owned it either wanted to be found or didn't care who came aboard. He reached the edge of the dock and stood there for a moment, looking down into the dark water below. The surface shifted gently, reflecting the lantern's glow in broken patterns. I chose to believe the first, he said quietly. Of course he did, because believing otherwise would have meant walking away. And Halvarin Doss had never been particularly good at walking away from opportunity. He lifted his gaze again, his expression steady, though something behind it had shifted. "The wood creaked when I stepped onto it," he said. "Not loudly. Just enough to remind me that I was no longer on the dock. A small difference, but one that mattered. Inside, it smelled of oil," he added. "Not the kind we use for lamps. Something heavier, sharper." He narrowed his eyes slightly, as if trying to see through the layers of time. "There were crates," he said, "stacked low, covered in cloth." His hand lifted slightly, as though reaching out to touch one again. "I didn't open them, not yet." That too had been a choice, not driven by caution, but by experience. "You learn, after a while," Halvarin said, "that the first thing you touch is rarely the thing that matters." He turned slightly, stepping away from the edge as the memory deepened. "The sound came from below deck," he continued. "Not a voice, not movement. A pause, a rhythm." He tapped 2 fingers lightly against the side of a crate as he spoke, slow, measured, like something being counted. The harbor remained as it was, still, distant, unchanged. But Halvarin's voice carried something else now, something quieter, something that did not belong entirely to the present. "I followed it," he said. And of course he did, because that was always the way. The dock behind him faded into memory. The lantern light dimmed, and the ship, that nameless vessel resting too low in the water, began to take shape once more. Not as it had been seen, but as it had been experienced, step by step, sound by sound, until the moment where curiosity no longer felt like a choice, but a path already taken. And below deck, something waited, not hidden, not revealed, just there, keeping its rhythm and waiting for someone to notice. The steps below deck were narrow, worn by years of passage, though Halvarin could not recall ever seeing the vessel before that night. Each plank shifted slightly beneath his weight, not enough to unsteady him, but enough to remind him that the ship had its own way of settling. The rhythm continued, slow, even, measured. It did not change as he descended. That, more than anything, held his attention. Most sounds altered when approached. Voices grew clearer, movement became defined. This did not. It remained exactly as it had been above, as though distance just did not matter to it. Halvarin reached the lower level and paused at the final step, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior. There was no lantern here, no obvious source of light, and yet he could see. Not clearly, but enough. The space stretched longer than expected, the ceiling low, supported by thick beams that carried the faint scent of resin and age. Crates lined the walls, stacked with a kind of care that suggested intention rather than haste. Cloth coverings hung loosely over them, edges swaying ever so slightly. Though no wind reached this place, the rhythm echoed again, closer now, still not louder, just nearer. Halvarin stepped forward, his hand brushing lightly along one of the crates as he passed. The wood felt cool, slightly damp, as though it had spent too long near the water. He stopped near the center of the hold. The sound came from beneath, not below the ship entirely, but beneath the floorboards of this level. He crouched slightly, placing his hand against the planks. There, the rhythm moved through the wood, not like footsteps, not like tools, something else. A pause between each motion, perfectly spaced, as if whatever created it had no need to rush, and no reason to stop. Halvarin remained there for a moment, his hand resting against the floor, feeling the faint tremor of each measured beat. Then he straightened, slowly, There are moments in a man's life where instinct offers two paths. One says to leave, the other says to understand. He had followed the second for most of his years, and it had rarely disappointed him. He turned his attention to the crates again. If something beneath the ship was moving with such precision, then whatever was above it had likely been placed there with equal care. He approached the nearest crate and pulled the cloth back just enough to see the wood beneath. No markings, no trade seal, no sign of origin. That alone was unusual. Even smugglers marked their goods, if only in ways only they could read. Halvorin ran his fingers along the edge, feeling for any irregularity. Nothing. No seams beyond the expected. No hidden compartments. Just a crate. And yet, not just a crate. He moved to the next, and then the next. Each the same, unmarked, uniform. Arranged with quiet precision, the rhythm continued. He glanced down again, his brow tightening slightly. Not cargo, he murmured. It was not a guess. It was a conclusion. Cargo shifted. It bore weight unevenly. These crates did not. They sat as though they were meant to remain exactly where they had been placed. He stepped back, letting his gaze travel across the entire hold. There were no ropes securing them, no wedges to keep them from sliding. And yet, they had not moved. Even with the tide, even with time. That was when he noticed the gaps, small spaces between certain crates, too narrow to pass through, too deliberate to ignore. He moved toward one of them, lowering himself slightly to see the floor more clearly. The planks here were not the same, subtle differences in grain, in color, in wear. A section replaced, carefully, without drawing attention. Halvorin reached down, pressing his palm against it. The rhythm felt stronger here, still not louder, but clearer, as if whatever lay beneath this part of the floor was closer to the surface. He tapped once lightly. The wood answered with a dull, hollow tone, not the solid sound of the surrounding planks. Something lay below, not part of the ship's structure. Something added. He sat back on his heels, considering. There were tools above deck. He could return, retrieve one, pry the board loose. It would not take long. And yet, he did not move, because the rhythm had changed, not in pace. Not in pattern, but in presence. It had been steady before, distant. Now it felt aware, not of him exactly, but of something. A shift, a recognition. He withdrew his hand slowly. The wood no longer felt simply like wood. It felt like a surface, over something that did not belong there. He stood again, his movements more measured now. Not cautious, but attentive. There was a difference. He stepped away from the altered planks and turned toward the far end of the hold. A narrow passage led further inward. He had not noticed it at first, because it did not draw the eye. It simply existed, like a path one only sees when already walking toward it. The rhythm seemed to follow him now, or perhaps he followed it. It was difficult to tell. The passage was tight, forcing him to angle his shoulders slightly as he moved through it. The air grew heavier, carrying that same sharp scent he had noticed before, though stronger now. Not unpleasant, but distinct. Deliberate. He reached the end of the passage and stopped. A door stood before him, simple in appearance. Wood, reinforced with iron bands. No lock, no handle. Just a flat surface, worn smooth in places where hands might have rested, though none had, not recently. The rhythm came from beyond it, closer now than ever before. Halvorin stood there for a moment, his gaze fixed on the door. There was no urgency in him, no rush to act. only that same quiet pull that had led him this far. He raised his hand, paused, not out of hesitation, but because something in the air had shifted again. The scent, the weight, the space itself. As though the ship had grown slightly smaller, or he had stepped into something more confined than wood and beam could explain. He rested his hand against the door. The surface was colder than it should have been, not chilled by night air, something deeper. The rhythm continued, unbroken, unchanged, but now it felt closer to completion. As if each measured beat was not just repeating, but approaching something. He pressed gently. The door did not resist. It opened without sound, and beyond it, the rhythm waited. Not hidden, not revealed, just present, as though it had always been there, and he had only now arrived where he was meant to hear it. The space beyond the door was smaller than the hold, though it did not feel confined. It held a different kind of stillness. Not the kind found in empty rooms, but the kind that settles where something has remained undisturbed for a very long time. Halvorin stepped inside. The door behind him stayed open, though the faint light from the hold did little to follow him in. Here, the darkness had shape, not complete, but defined. He could make out the edges of the room, the low ceiling, the curved ribs of the ship's structure, the uneven floor beneath his boots. And at the center, the source of the rhythm. It rested on a raised platform, no more than a few inches above the floor. A box, or something shaped like one. It was not large, perhaps the length of a man's arm, no wider than his shoulders, wrapped in dark material that did not reflect the faint light behind him. No markings, no seams, just form. The rhythm came from within it, steady, measured, unchanging. Halvorin did not approach immediately. He remained where he stood, allowing his eyes to adjust further, allowing the presence of the object to settle into something more understandable. There are things in the world that reveal themselves through motion, and others through stillness. This was neither. It did not move, yet it did not feel still. He took a step forward. The sound did not change. Another. Still the same. He circled slightly, keeping a respectful distance, his gaze fixed on the box as he studied it from different angles. No hinges, no visible opening, no sign of how it had been brought here, or why. Only that it was here, and that it kept its rhythm. He stopped at the edge of the platform and crouched slowly, bringing himself closer to it. The air here felt thinner, not lacking, but altered, as though something subtle had been removed. He reached out, his hand hovering just above the surface. He did not touch it, not yet. The rhythm continued. He waited, not for it to stop, but for it to change, for some indication that his presence mattered. It did not. The beat remained as it had been, perfectly spaced, unaware, or unconcerned. Halvorin let his hand lower, until his fingertips brushed the surface. Cold. Not the kind of cold that comes from night air or damp wood. A deeper absence of warmth, as though the material itself had never known it. He did not pull away. Instead, he rested his hand there, feeling the faint vibration pass through it with each measured beat. It was subtle, barely there, but consistent, like the ticking of something too large to hear properly, yet impossible to ignore once noticed. He leaned slightly closer. "There you are," he murmured, not in triumph but in recognition, because this, whatever it was, had drawn him here, not through force, but through presence. And now that he had found it, the question was no longer where it was, but what it was. He shifted his hand slightly, pressing just enough to test the surface. Solid. No give. No sign of weakness. No indication that it could be opened by ordinary means. He traced the edge with his fingers, smooth, unbroken. The wrapping, or whatever covered it, seemed continuous, as though it had not been placed around the object, but formed with it. He sat back slightly, considering. There were tools above. Ways to break it open, to force whatever lay inside into the open air, and yet he remained still, because the rhythm had shifted again, not in sound, not in pace, but in feeling. It no longer seemed distant, nor separate. It felt aligned with him, not responding, not reacting, simply existing in the same space. And that alone was enough to give him pause. He withdrew his hand slowly. The vibration faded from his fingertips, but the sense of it lingered. He exhaled quietly, his gaze still fixed on the box. "There are easier things to sell," he said, almost to himself. A faint echo of his old trade slipping through. But there was no value here he could measure, no buyer he could name, no transaction that made sense. Only this, a thing that did not belong, placed carefully in the lowest part of a nameless ship, carried without markings, left without explanation. He rose slowly, his joints protesting the motion more than they once would have. Time had its own rhythm, less precise but no less persistent. He took a step back. The rhythm continued, unchanged. He turned slightly, looking toward the open door behind him. The faint light beyond seemed distant now, not physically, but in feeling, as though crossing back through it would require more than just a step. He glanced once more at the box, then at the floor beneath it. And that was when he noticed it. The pattern, faint lines etched into the wood of the platform. Too subtle to see at first, but now clear. They curved outward from the center, not randomly, not decorative, intentional, like a path or a guide. He lowered himself again, this time focusing not on the object, but on the shape beneath it. The lines extended just beyond the platform, fading as they reached the surrounding floor, as though something had once followed them, and then stopped. He traced one lightly with his finger. The wood here felt different, not worn, not aged. Something else. As if it had been shaped not by tools, but by pressure, repeated, measured, the rhythm. He looked back at the box, then down at the lines again. "It's not counting," he said quietly. A realization, not a question. "It's following." The beat, the pattern, the placement, all of it aligned, not with time, but with position, with movement, or perhaps with something that had once moved. He stood again, slower this time, more certain, because whatever this was, it had not been placed here randomly. It had been positioned, deliberately, carefully, and whatever purpose it served, it had not yet finished. The rhythm continued, unchanged, uninterrupted. But now, it no longer felt like a sound. It felt like a process. One that had been set in motion long before he stepped aboard, and one that would continue, whether he remained there or chose to leave. Halvarin turned toward the door once more, but he did not step through it. Not yet, because the choice before him had shifted. It was no longer about opening the box or uncovering its contents. It was about something quieter, something more difficult, whether to remain with it or to walk away and leave it exactly as it had been found, still, measured and waiting for someone else to notice. Halvarin did not leave the room, not immediately. The doorway remained behind him, a narrow frame of dim light leading back toward the hold, toward the familiar weight of wood and rope and cargo. But his attention stayed with the platform, with the lines, with the steady, unbroken rhythm that now felt less like a sound and more like a presence that had quietly settled into the space around him. He stepped to the side, moving slowly along the edge of the room, not circling the box this time, observing the walls. There were markings here as well, faint, almost lost beneath the grain of the wood and the wear of time. He ran his fingers lightly across one of the beams. The surface was uneven, the grooves shallow and irregular, but they followed no natural pattern of aging. They had been made, carved perhaps, or pressed, repeatedly, not with force, but with intention. Halvarin leaned closer, narrowing his eyes slightly. The lines did not form symbols he recognized, not trademarks, not letters, nothing that could be read in the usual way. They curved, intersected, diverged, and then returned, always returning. He traced one of them further along the beam until it disappeared into shadow. The rhythm continued behind him, unchanging. He did not turn, not yet. Instead, he followed the line downward, where it met the edge of the platform. There, the pattern became clearer, not as something to be read, but as something to be followed. He straightened slowly. "It's not for looking," he murmured, a realization forming in pieces. "It's for moving." The words lingered in the air, settling into the same quiet space as the rhythm. He turned then, his gaze returning to the box. It remained as it had been, still, centered, unmarked, and yet no longer separate from the room. It was part of it, as though the entire space had been shaped around it. He stepped forward again, more carefully this time, placing his foot just outside the faint lines that spread across the floor. The wood beneath his boot felt slightly different, not softer, not weaker, just distinct. He shifted his weight. The rhythm did not change, but something in the air responded, a subtle tightening, a narrowing of space that could not be seen, only felt. He stilled, waited. Nothing followed. No sound, no movement. The room returned to its previous stillness, as though the shift had never occurred. Halvarin exhaled slowly. Then he adjusted his position, placing his foot just inside one of the lines. The difference was immediate, not dramatic, but clear. The rhythm aligned more closely, not louder, not faster, just nearer, as if his position within the pattern had brought him closer to its source, even without moving toward the box itself. He took another step, following the curve, each movement deliberate, measured. He did not rush. There was no need. The path revealed itself slowly, not as a clear direction, but as a series of choices that felt more correct than others. He moved along the edge of the platform, tracing the faint grooves with his steps. The rhythm remained steady, but the room shifted. Not physically. The walls did not move. The beams did not change. And yet, something about the space felt more defined, as though it were paying closer attention. He stopped. The box sat just beyond him now, no longer directly in front, but slightly to his left. The lines beneath his feet curved inward, toward it. He looked down, then back at the object, then down again. And without thinking, he stepped forward, onto the platform. The moment his foot crossed the boundary, the rhythm changed. Not in pace, not in sound, in depth. It felt closer, not through the air, but through him. A faint echo of it passed through his chest, his arms, his fingertips, as though the distance between source and listener had been reduced to nothing at all. He did not move for a moment, letting the sensation settle. It was not uncomfortable, not painful, just present. He took another step, then another, until he stood directly before the box, closer than he had been before, close enough to see the surface more clearly. The material, if it could be called that, did not reflect light in any usual way. It absorbed it, not completely, but enough to soften its edges to make it appear less defined the longer one looked at it. He leaned slightly forward. The rhythm continued, measured, exact, unchanging, but now unmistakably near. He reached out again, this time without hesitation. His hand came to rest fully against the surface. The vibration passed through his palm, up his arm, steady, consistent, and beneath it, something else. A second motion, fainter, almost hidden. He stilled, focused. There it was. Between each measured beat, a shift, not in the object, in the space around it, as though something was moving along the lines beneath the floor, following the pattern, completing it. He drew his hand back slowly, then looked down at the platform. The faint grooves seemed clearer now, not brighter but more present. He followed one with his gaze as it curved outward, disappearing into the surrounding floor. Then another, and another, each one part of something larger, something that extended beyond this room, beyond the ship, perhaps even beyond the harbor itself. He stepped back carefully, retracing his steps along the lines. The moment his foot left the platform, the deeper sensation faded. The rhythm returned to its previous distance, still there, still constant, but no longer within him. He exhaled again, slower this time, more deliberate. "Not cargo," he said. The words held a different weight now. "Not a container." He glanced once more at the box, then at the lines, then toward the doorway. "It's a point." The room offered no response, but the understanding remained. This was not something meant to be opened, not something meant to be taken. It was meant to be placed. And left, because whatever it was doing, it was not meant to be interrupted. Halvorin turned at last toward the door. The faint light beyond seemed steadier now, more real. The path back had not changed, only his understanding of what lay behind him. He took a step forward, then another, leaving the platform, leaving the lines, leaving the box at the center of its quiet, measured work. The rhythm continued as he reached the threshold, unbroken, unconcerned, as though his presence had never altered it, as though it had always been this way, and always would be. He paused once more at the doorway, his hand resting lightly against the frame. Then, without looking back, he stepped through, and the room behind him returned to itself, still, measured, and waiting. The passage felt narrower on the way back, not by measure, but by awareness. Halvorin moved through it without haste, one hand brushing lightly along the wooden beam as he passed, feeling the faint imperfections beneath his fingertips. The scent in the air lingered, sharp, unfamiliar, yet no longer as intrusive as before. It had become part of the space, or perhaps he had. The rhythm followed him, not as closely as it had within the chamber, but still present, still steady, as though distance held little meaning to whatever sustained it. He stepped into the hold again. The crates stood as they had before, their coverings unmoved, their arrangement unchanged. For a moment, the room felt ordinary. Wood, rope, cargo, the slow rise and fall of the ship with the tide. But that feeling did not last, because now he could see the spaces between the crates differently. The gaps were no longer incidental. They were aligned, each one placed with the same careful attention as the lines beneath the platform. He walked among them, slower now, tracing the layout with his eyes. The crates did not form rows. They formed paths, subtle, narrow, easy to overlook unless one had already learned to notice. He stepped into one of the spaces, positioning himself between two stacks. The air shifted slightly, not in temperature, in movement. It flowed differently here, redirected, guided, as though the crates themselves shaped it. He turned his head, following the direction of that subtle current. It led toward the altered planks he had noticed earlier, toward the place where the rhythm felt strongest through the floor. He moved toward it again, not to investigate, but to confirm. He crouched once more, placing his hand against the wood. The vibration met him immediately, familiar now, expected, but beneath it, that same secondary motion, faint, persistent, moving along a path he could not see, but could now understand. "It's not just here," he said quietly. The realization came without effort, because the pattern did not end at the platform. It extended, through the hold, through the structure of the ship, perhaps even beyond. He sat back slightly, resting his hands on his knees. There had been many nights in his life where he had stood on the edge of something unknown, deals that carried risk, routes that led through uncertain waters, encounters that required careful judgment, and in those moments, he had always asked the same question: what is this worth? But now, the question felt misplaced. There was no exchange here, no transaction waiting to be made, only a presence, a function, a process unfolding without regard for those who might witness it. He rose slowly, his joints settling into the motion with quiet familiarity. The hold no longer held his attention in the same way, not because it had changed, but because he had seen what lay beneath its surface. And once seen, it did not need to be examined again. He turned toward the stairs. The planks creaked softly under his weight as he ascended, each step carrying him back toward the open air of the deck above. The rhythm followed, fainter now, but still present, like something that did not remain in one place, but moved with him, or perhaps had never been confined to the ship at all. He emerged onto the deck. The night had not changed. The mist still hovered over the water. The lanterns still swayed gently, casting their narrow circles of light across the dock. For a moment, everything felt as it had before. Simple, familiar, grounded. He stepped off the ship. His boots met the wooden planks of the dock with a dull, steady sound. The difference was immediate. The rhythm faded, not completely, but enough. As though stepping away had placed a distance between him and whatever had been set in motion below. He did not turn back right away. Instead, he walked a few paces along the dock, his gaze drifting across the harbor. Other ships rested in their places, their silhouettes softened by the mist. Some bore banners, some names, some carried the faint sounds of crew settling in for the night. Ordinary, recognizable. He stopped. Then, slowly, he turned. The nameless ship remained where it had been, unmarked, unclaimed, its surface unchanged. No sign of movement, no indication that anything within it differed from the others. And yet, he knew. He stepped closer again, though he did not board it this time. Instead, he stood at the edge of the dock, studying its shape. The hull sat low in the water, too low, as it had before. But now, he understood why. It was not carrying weight in the usual sense, not cargo, not goods, something else. Something that settled deeper than mass, something that anchored it in place. He tilted his head slightly, listening. The rhythm could still be felt. Faint, distant, but present. Not confined to the ship, not entirely. He glanced along the length of the dock, then beyond it, toward the stone walls of the city, toward the streets that climbed upward into the dim-lit distance, the pattern beneath the platform, the paths between the crates, the movement along the floor. They had all suggested direction, not random placement, but alignment. He stepped back from the edge of the dock, his gaze shifting from the ship to the harbor itself. "There are others," he said. The words were quiet, not certain, but close, because if this was a point, then there would be more, placed elsewhere, following the same unseen pattern, connected, not by sight, but by absence, by the subtle ways space changed when something did not belong, and yet had been placed with purpose. He exhaled slowly. The harbor remained as it was, unchanged, unaware. But Halvarin Doss had spent enough years watching the movements of trade, of people, of tides, to recognize when something moved beneath the surface of things. And this, whatever it was, moved without being seen. He picked up his lantern. The flame flickered briefly, then steadied. He looked once more at the ship, then turned away. Because there are moments when understanding does not require action, when the value lies not in taking, but in knowing. He walked along the dock, his steps slow, deliberate. The rhythm faded further with each step, not gone, never entirely gone, but distant, as though it belonged to something larger than the place he had just left, something that extended beyond the harbor, beyond the city, and into spaces that did not reveal themselves easily. He did not look back again, because the ship would remain, as it had before, as it would after, unmarked, unclaimed, and quietly, part of something that did not need to announce itself, only to continue, measured, steady, and waiting to be noticed again. Halvarin did not leave the harbor that night, not entirely. His steps carried him away from the dock, past the rows of moored vessels and stacked cargo, into the narrow paths where the planks gave way to worn stone. The lantern in his hand cast a steady glow ahead of him, stretching across the ground in soft, shifting shapes. Behind him, the ship remained where it had been. He did not need to see it to know that, because something of it had not been left behind. The rhythm had faded, yes, but not vanished. It lingered, not as a sound, as a memory, a pattern that had settled somewhere deeper, where it did not need to be heard to be followed. He moved through the harbor's edge, where fewer people walked at this hour. A stray voice drifted in the distance. A door closed somewhere above. The faint movement of water against stone, ordinary sounds expected, and yet he began to notice the spaces between them, the pauses, the moments where something should have been present, but was not. He slowed, not because he had reached a destination, because something had shifted. He stopped near a low archway that led toward one of the side streets. The stone beneath his feet felt different here, smoother, more worn, but not only from traffic. There were faint markings, barely visible in the lantern light, lines, curving, intersecting. He lowered the lantern slightly, bringing the glow closer to the ground. There, the pattern again, not identical to the one beneath the ship, but similar, connected. He crouched, tracing one of the lines lightly with his fingers. The stone was cool, dry, unremarkable to anyone who passed over it without pause. But now, it held the same quiet presence, the same suggestion of something moving just beyond the reach of sight. He followed the line as it curved beneath the archway. Then another. They led inward, into the city. Halvarin remained still for a moment, his hand resting lightly against the stone. Then he rose, slowly. He did not question it, did not hesitate, because the path had already begun to reveal itself, and once seen, it could not be unseen. He stepped beneath the archway. The air changed, not dramatically, but enough. The harbor's open space gave way to narrower streets, where buildings leaned closer together and shadows settled more deeply between them. The lantern light reached less here, and what it did reach seemed to absorb it more readily. He moved forward, each step measured, not cautious, attentive. The lines appeared again, faint, subtle, woven into the stone in ways that would have gone unnoticed before. They curved along the street, sometimes disappearing beneath debris or worn patches, only to reappear a few steps later. He followed them without thinking, not because he understood where they led, but because they felt correct. At a turning, the lines shifted direction. He followed. At a narrow passage between two buildings, they narrowed. He adjusted his path. The rhythm did not return in full, but there were moments, brief, subtle, where the air seemed to hesitate, where movement paused just slightly before continuing. And in those moments he felt it, the same alignment he had sensed on the platform, not as strong, but present. He stopped again. The passage opened into a small courtyard, enclosed by high walls of stone and timber. There was no one here, no light beyond his own. Just the stillness of a space long since forgotten by those who lived around it. The lines converged at the center. He approached slowly. The ground here was uneven, broken in places where time had taken its toll, and yet the pattern remained, not worn away, not disrupted, as though it had been placed beyond the reach of ordinary change. He stood at the center. The lantern cast its glow outward, catching the edges of the courtyard walls, and for a moment, the rhythm returned, faint, measured, not from beneath him, not from around him, from somewhere beyond, as though this place was another point, connected, aligned. Part of the same unseen structure. He did not move, he did not need to. The understanding settled into him without effort. There were more, not just one ship, not just one chamber, not just one placement, many, scattered, hidden in plain sight, each one subtle, each one quiet, each one part of something that did not demand attention, but waited for it. He lowered the lantern slightly. The light shifted across the ground, revealing more of the lines. They extended outward from this point as well, leading elsewhere, further into the city, perhaps beyond. He exhaled slowly, not in surprise, not in concern, but in recognition, because the pattern did not feel random, it did not feel chaotic, it felt intentional, placed, designed, not to be found easily, but to be followed, once noticed. He stepped back from the center. The faint echo of the rhythm faded again, leaving only the quiet presence of the courtyard behind. He turned, not toward the lines, not toward the next path, but back the way he had come, because there are moments when understanding reaches a point where continuing forward adds nothing more, where the knowledge itself is enough. He moved through the passage once more, his steps slower now, more grounded. The lines remained, the patterns held, but they no longer pulled him. They simply existed. He emerged from the archway again, the harbor's distant sounds returning in familiar ways. The lantern light seemed steadier here, more defined. He walked back toward the docks, not because he needed to, but because the path had come full circle, and the ship, the nameless vessel resting low in the water, was still part of it, as it always would be. He reached the edge of the harbor once more. The mist had thinned slightly. The outlines of the ships were clearer now. The lanterns swayed gently, their reflections stretching across the dark surface of the water. He stopped, looked out. Then, slowly, he nodded. Not in agreement, not in approval, but in acknowledgement. Because whatever this was, it did not require his action, only his awareness, and that he now carried with him. Halvorin returned to his place along the dock. The crate was where he had left it. The lantern, too, its flame smaller now but steady, casting that same narrow circle of light across the worn planks. He set his own lantern beside it and lowered himself down with care, resting his back against the wood. The harbor had settled into its late rhythm, not the rhythm he had followed below deck, nor the faint echo he had felt beneath the streets. A different one, less precise, less certain, but familiar. Water against hull, rope shifting with the tide. A distant step, then another somewhere beyond sight. He reached for the cup he had left behind and turned it slightly in his hand. The surface caught the light again, just as it had before. For a moment, everything felt unchanged. As though the hours between had been no more than a passing thought. But that was not quite true, because the harbor was the same. The ship was the same. The night held its shape. Only he had shifted. He lifted the cup, paused, then set it down without drinking. His gaze drifted across the water, settling briefly on the nameless vessel. It rested low, just as before, unmarked, unmoving. No sign of what lay within, no sign that anything had been discovered or understood. And yet, he no longer looked at it as something to approach or to uncover. It had taken its place, as part of something larger than a single night or a single man's curiosity. He leaned his head back slightly, letting his eyes rest for a moment. The rhythm did not return, not fully, but there were traces. In the pauses between sounds, in the way the wind moved, then shifted, in the small hesitations that passed unnoticed, unless one had learned to notice them. He opened his eyes again. The lantern beside him flickered once, then steadied. A small motion, easy to miss, but now he did not. He turned his hand slightly, resting it against the wood of the dock. The planks were worn, marked by years of use, and yet, beneath that, there were faint impressions. Nothing as defined as the lines in the chamber, nothing as clear as the patterns beneath the city stones. But enough. Enough to suggest that the pattern did not begin at the ship, nor end within the city. It extended, quietly, subtly, through places that did not call attention to themselves. He withdrew his hand and rested it against his knee. There was no urgency in him, no desire to follow the lines further, to seek out the next point, or the next, because the path, once seen, did not need to be walked entirely to be understood. He looked out across the harbor once more. A ship shifted slightly as the tide turned. Another lantern dimmed somewhere in the distance. The mist moved in slow, drifting layers. And within all of it, the absence remained. Not visible, not defined, but present. In the spaces where something should have been and was not. He exhaled slowly. The cup remained untouched beside him. The night carried on, unchanged, as it always would. He thought briefly of the first step onto the gangplank, of the creak beneath his boots, of the decision made without hesitation. It had not been a mistake, nor had it been necessary. It had simply been the path taken. He shifted slightly, adjusting his position against the crate. The wood pressed into his shoulder in a familiar way, solid, grounded, a point of certainty. He closed his eyes again, not to sleep, not to withdraw, but to rest within the understanding that had settled over him. There were many things in Baldur's Gate that moved unseen, deals made in shadows, routes known only to a few, goods passed from hand to hand without record or trace. He had spent years navigating those currents, learning where to look, what to listen for, what to avoid. And now, there was something else, not hidden in the same way, not concealed by intent, but by its nature, by the fact that it did not need to be seen to exist. The pattern remained. The points held their place. The rhythm continued, whether followed or not. He opened his eyes once more. The lantern light seemed softer now, or perhaps his gaze had adjusted. The ship was still there, unchanged, as it would be, as it had been. He did not look at it for long. Instead, his attention shifted outward, across the harbor, toward the city, toward the places where stone met shadow and paths crossed in ways that were not always clear. He knew now that the pattern extended there and beyond, not as something to chase, but as something to recognize, if ever it revealed itself again. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. The cup remained beside him, untouched. The night deepened. The harbor breathed. And Halvar endorsed sat at the edge of it all, no longer searching, no longer questioning, simply aware of the quiet ways the world arranged itself, of the spaces between what was seen and what was not, and of the paths that did not demand to be followed, only noticed, somewhere far beneath the surface of things. The rhythm continued, measured, steady, uninterrupted. And here, at the edge of the water, beneath the slow sway of lantern light, that was enough.